Close your eyes and imagine the smell of salt air and tar and gunpowder. Imagine the creak of wooden timbers and the snap of canvas sails, and the low murmur of men who have placed themselves beyond the reach of every law that civilization has written. Imagine a world where the coastline of America, from the frozen harbours of New England to the mangrove swamps of Florida, to the sugar islands of the Caribbean, was prowled by men and women who lived by plunder and died by the rope, and whose brief, violent, extraordinary lives shaped the history of the New World in ways that are still felt today. This is the story of the real pirates of America, and I want you to settle in, let your body relax, let your breathing slow, and let me carry you across 3 centuries of salt spray and cannon smoke and buried treasure and desperate courage to a time when the Atlantic Ocean was the most dangerous place on earth. The golden age of piracy, the period that gave us Blackbeard and Calico Jack and Anne Bonny and every pirate story you have ever heard, lasted barely a generation, roughly from about 1700 to 1730, and in that short span of time, a few thousand men and a handful of women created a legend so powerful that we're still telling their stories 300 years later. But piracy in American waters did not begin or end with the Golden Age. It began almost as soon as Europeans arrived in the New World, and it continued in various forms well into the 19th century, and the full story is far stranger, far more complex, and far more deeply woven into the fabric of American history than most people realize. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the 16th century, when the first European powers were carving up the New World among themselves, and the line between piracy and patriotism was so blurred that it barely existed at all. Spain, by virtue of Columbus's voyage and the Treaty of Tordesillas, claimed virtually the entire Western Hemisphere, and for the first half of the 16th century, Spanish treasure fleets sailed home from the Americas loaded with gold and silver from the mines of Mexico and Peru. The wealth was staggering. Let me tell you about the Spanish treasure fleets, because understanding them is essential to understanding why piracy flourished in the Americas, and the sheer scale of the wealth they carried is almost impossible to comprehend from a modern perspective. The system worked like this. Twice a year, a convoy of merchant ships would gather at Havana, Cuba, after collecting cargoes of gold, silver, emeralds, pearls, cochineal dye, indigo, tobacco, sugar, and hundreds of other valuable commodities from ports throughout the Spanish colonies in Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. The Tierra Firme fleet sailed from Cartagena and Portobello, carrying the silver of Peru that had been transported overland from the Pacific coast. The New Spain fleet sailed from Veracruz, carrying the silver of Mexico, much of it mined by indigenous and enslaved African labourers in the great silver mines of Zacatecas, Guanajuato, and Potosi, the legendary mountain of silver in present-day Bolivia that produced so much ore that it literally reshaped the global economy. The 2 fleets met at Havana, where they were joined by heavily armed warships called galleons that served as escorts, and the combined fleet then sailed through the Florida Straits and across the Atlantic to Seville, the Spanish port that held a monopoly on New World trade. The amount of silver that flowed through this system was astronomical. Between 1500 and 1800, approximately 150,000 tons of silver crossed the Atlantic from the Americas to Spain, and much of it passed through the pirate-infested waters of the Caribbean. A single galleon might carry the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in modern currency, and the capture of even one treasure ship could make a pirate crew wealthy beyond imagination. The treasure fleets were well defended, and successful attacks on the main convoys were rare, but ships that fell behind or strayed from the fleet, ships caught in hurricanes, ships that ran aground on the treacherous reefs and shoals of the Caribbean, these were the targets that pirates and privateers dreamed about, and the hurricanes of the Caribbean were as much an enemy of the treasure fleets as any pirate, and the wrecks they created are among the richest archaeological sites in the world. In 1715, an entire Spanish treasure fleet of 11 ships was destroyed by a hurricane off the coast of Florida, scattering millions of pesos worth of silver, gold, and jewels across the ocean floor from Fort Pierce to Melbourne Beach. The 1715 fleet wrecks have been the subject of treasure hunting expeditions since the 18th century, and millions of dollars in treasure have been recovered, but experts believe that most of the fleet's cargo remains buried in the sand waiting to be discovered. In 1733, another hurricane destroyed a fleet of 22 Spanish ships in the Florida Keys, and the wreck sites from that disaster are still producing artifacts and treasure nearly 3 centuries later. The most famous treasure hunter in American history, Mel Fisher, spent 16 years searching for the Nuestra Señora de Atocha, a Spanish galleon that sank in a hurricane off the Florida Keys in 1622, before finally locating the main treasure deposit in 1985. The Atocha's cargo, valued at approximately $450 million, included 40 tons of gold and silver, Colombian emeralds the size of a man's fist, and Venezuelan pearls of extraordinary quality. Fisher's discovery made headlines around the world and demonstrated that the legends of sunken pirate treasure were rooted in genuine historical fact. The 1715 Spanish treasure fleet, another famous wreck, met its end when a hurricane struck 11 ships off the coast of Florida, sending more than 14 million pesos in silver, gold, and jewels to the bottom of the sea. The disaster was so catastrophic that it destabilized the Spanish economy, and the wreck sites, scattered along what is now called the Treasure Coast of Florida, are still yielding discoveries to this day. The annual treasure fleet, the Flota de Indias, carried enough precious metal to finance empires, and the sight of those heavily laden galleons making their way through the Caribbean and across the Atlantic was an irresistible temptation to every other European power that felt cheated out of the New World's riches. The competition for the riches of the New World drove the European powers into a state of almost perpetual conflict that lasted for 3 centuries, and the first casualties of that conflict were the treasure ships of the Spanish Empire. The French were the first to strike. As early as the 1520s, French corsairs were attacking Spanish treasure ships in the Atlantic, and Jean Fleury, a French privateer, captured 2 of Hernán Cortés's treasure ships in 1523, sending to France a stunning cargo of Aztec gold, emeralds, jade, and feathered cloaks that astonished the court of King Francis I and demonstrated to all of Europe that the New World contained riches beyond imagination. The French corsairs of the 16th century, men like François Leclerc, the first pirate known to have used a wooden leg, and Jacques de Sorès, who sacked Havana in 1555, established the Caribbean as a theatre of irregular warfare that would persist for 2 centuries. The Dutch joined the fray in the early 17th century, and Piet Hein, a Dutch privateer who captured the entire Spanish silver fleet off the coast of Cuba in 1628, pulled off the greatest single prize in the history of piracy, a haul of gold and silver worth approximately 12 million guilders, enough to finance the Dutch war effort against Spain for 8 months. England, France, and the Netherlands responded with a practice that would define the next 2 centuries of Atlantic history. They issued letters of marque, official government documents that authorized private ship captains to attack and plunder the vessels of enemy nations in exchange for a share of the spoils. These authorized pirates were called privateers, and they occupied a strange and morally ambiguous position in the world of the 16th and 17th centuries. They were pirates to their victims but patriots to their sponsors, and the distinction between the two depended entirely on whose flag you were flying and whose ships you were robbing. Sir Francis Drake, who circumnavigated the globe and plundered Spanish settlements from Chile to California, was a pirate to the Spanish but a national hero to the English, and Drake's raid on the Spanish Main in 1585 and 1586 was one of the most devastating pirate campaigns in history. He sacked Santo Domingo, the capital of the Spanish Caribbean, and then sailed north to burn the city of Cartagena de Indias, the most heavily fortified port in the New World, holding it for ransom before continuing to the coast of Florida, where he destroyed the Spanish settlement at St. Augustine, the oldest European city in North America. Drake's raids demonstrated that no Spanish colony in the Americas was safe from English maritime aggression, and they established a pattern of state-sponsored piracy that would continue for the next 2 centuries. The Spanish called Drake el Drac and considered him the most dangerous man alive, and the fear he inspired along the coasts of the Americas was so profound that Spanish mothers reportedly used his name to frighten misbehaving children. Queen Elizabeth I knighted him on the deck of his ship, the Golden Hind, in a ceremony that was essentially a state endorsement of piracy. The privateering tradition was deeply embedded in American colonial life from the very beginning. The colonies were far from the mother country, poorly defended, and chronically short of money, and privateering offered a way to supplement colonial economies while simultaneously weakening rival powers. Privateering was big business in colonial America, and it touched every level of society from the wealthiest merchants to the poorest sailors. The economics were straightforward and irresistibly attractive. A shipowner would invest in fitting out a vessel for war, obtaining a letter of marque from the colonial governor, hiring a captain and crew, and equipping the ship with cannon, small arms, and provisions. If the privateer was successful in capturing enemy ships, the prizes were brought into port and sold at auction by a prize court, and the proceeds were divided among the investors, the captain, and the crew according to a predetermined formula. The potential profits were enormous. A single rich prize could return 10 or 20 times the original investment, and during the wars of the 18th century, privateering made fortunes for merchants in every major colonial port. During the American Revolution, the Continental Congress authorized more than 1,700 letters of marque, and American privateers captured or destroyed approximately 600 British merchant vessels, a contribution to the war effort that was arguably as important as anything accomplished by the Continental Navy, which was tiny by comparison. The privateers of the Revolution included some of the most colourful characters in American history, men like Jonathan Harridan of Salem, Massachusetts, who captured an astonishing 1,000 British vessels during the course of the war, and was regarded by the British as one of the most dangerous enemies they faced at sea. The wealth that flowed through Salem, Boston, Philadelphia, and other privateering ports during the Revolution helped finance the war and enriched the mercantile families who would become the economic elite of the new republic. The privateering tradition did not end with the Revolution. During the War of 1812, American privateers once again sailed out from every port on the Atlantic coast to prey on British merchant shipping, and their impact on the war was enormous. The most famous privateer of the War of 1812 was the schooner Chasseur, commanded by Captain Thomas Boyle of Baltimore, who was so successful and so audacious that he sent a proclamation to be posted at Lloyd's Coffee House in London, the centre of the British maritime insurance industry, declaring a one-ship blockade of the entire British Isles. The gesture was tongue-in-cheek, but it was also a genuine reflection of the damage that Boyle and other American privateers were inflicting on British commerce. The privateers of Baltimore, a city that was one of the great maritime centres of the early Republic, were particularly effective, and their depredations on British shipping were one of the factors that motivated the British attack on Baltimore in September of 1814, the attack that inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner as he watched the bombardment of Fort McHenry from the deck of a ship in the harbour. The connection between privateering and the national anthem is one of those wonderful ironies of American history that most people never learn about. John Hancock, the President of the Continental Congress, whose oversized signature on the Declaration of Independence became synonymous with signing one's name, had made his fortune in part through privateering and smuggling, and he was far from the only founding father whose wealth had roots in the ambiguous territory between legitimate trade and maritime plunder. During every war between the European powers, American colonial ports issued letters of marque to local ship captains, who fitted out their vessels with cannon and crew, and sailed out to hunt enemy merchantmen. The story of Captain William Kidd perfectly illustrates the blurry line between privateering and piracy that defined the colonial era. Kidd was a respectable New York ship captain and landowner who was commissioned in 1695 by a group of powerful English investors, including the governor of New York, to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean. The commission was essentially a privateering license disguised as a law enforcement mandate, and Kidd set sail in the Adventure Galley with a crew that grew increasingly mutinous as months passed without any profitable prizes. Whether Kidd actually became a pirate or simply made desperate decisions under impossible circumstances is a question that historians still debate, but the result was the same. He captured a wealthy merchant vessel called the Quedar Merchant, whose cargo included silk, gold, and other treasures, and when he returned to the American colonies expecting to be welcomed as a successful privateer, he was instead arrested, shipped to England, tried for piracy and murder, and hanged at Execution Dock in London in May of 1701. His body was coated in tar and displayed in an iron cage at the entrance to the Thames as a warning to other pirates, where it remained for years, slowly decomposing in the wind and rain. The Kidd case was a political scandal that reached the highest levels of English government, and the treasure he allegedly buried somewhere on the American coast, possibly on Gardiner's Island in Long Island Sound, has been the subject of treasure hunts for more than 3 centuries. Newport, Rhode Island was one of the great privateering ports of colonial America, and the wealth that flowed through its harbour from captured prizes helped build the mansions and churches and wharves that made it one of the most prosperous towns in the colonies. But the line between privateering and piracy was always thin, and when wars ended and the letters of marque expired, many privateer captains found it difficult to give up the profitable business of plunder. This was the pattern that produced the golden age of piracy. The War of the Spanish Succession, known in America as Queen Anne's War, raged from 1702 to 1713 and employed thousands of privateers on all sides. But the Caribbean was not the only theatre of piracy that affected the American colonies. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, a distant pirate haven on the island of Madagascar, off the southeastern coast of Africa, was connected to the American colonies by a trade route that historians call the Pirate Round. Pirates based in Madagascar preyed on the rich merchant ships of the Indian Ocean, particularly the treasure-laden vessels of the Mughal Empire and the East India Company, and then brought their plunder back to the American colonies, where corrupt merchants and officials in New York, Rhode Island, and the Carolinas were happy to buy stolen goods at a fraction of their value and ask no questions about their origins. The most famous pirate of the round was Henry Every, also known as Long Ben or the King of Pirates, who in 1695 captured the Ganges Sawai, one of the wealthiest ships in the Indian Ocean, a Mughal treasure vessel carrying gold, silver, jewels and passengers returning from the pilgrimage to Mecca. The haul was so enormous that each member of Every's crew received a share worth the equivalent of a lifetime's wages for a common sailor, and the capture provoked an international incident that threatened to destroy the East India Company's trade with the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb was furious that his subjects had been robbed and reportedly threatened to expel all English traders from his domains unless the pirates were brought to justice. The English government launched a worldwide manhunt for Every, offering a £500 reward, an enormous sum for the time, but Every was never caught. He and his crew scattered to the winds after dividing the treasure, and Every himself disappeared from history so completely that his fate remains unknown. Some accounts say he returned to England and lived out his days in poverty, after being cheated by merchants to whom he had entrusted his wealth. Others say he retired comfortably under an assumed name. His story inspired one of the first pirate novels, The Life and Adventures of Captain Singleton by Daniel Defoe, and his successful escape from justice made him a folk hero to common sailors who dreamed of making one great score and disappearing with the money. The Pirate Round created a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of colonial government. Benjamin Fletcher, the royal governor of New York in the 1690s, was known to have accepted bribes from pirates in exchange for protection, and the merchants of New York City openly traded with pirate vessels that anchored in the harbour. The Pirate Round eventually provoked the British government into action, leading to the commission given to Captain Kidd, and the crackdown on colonial corruption that followed was one of the factors that drove the pirates out of the Indian Ocean and back to the Caribbean, where they would create the Golden Age. When the Treaty of Utrecht ended the war in 1713, these men were suddenly out of work with no skills except seamanship and violence, no prospects except poverty and easy access to ships and weapons. Many of them simply kept doing what they had been doing, except now they were doing it without government authorization, which meant they were no longer privateers but pirates. Before I tell you about the pirates of the Golden Age, let me take you to the place that was the capital of piracy in the New World for much of the 17th century, a place so debauched and so wealthy that it was called the wickedest city on earth. Port Royal, Jamaica, was the great pirate port of the Caribbean, and its story is one of the most extraordinary in the history of the Americas. Jamaica had been captured from Spain by England in 1655, and the English authorities, lacking the military resources to defend the island from Spanish counterattack, made a devil's bargain with the buccaneers, the bands of pirates and privateers who operated throughout the Caribbean. The governor of Jamaica issued letters of marque to the buccaneers, authorizing them to attack Spanish shipping and settlements, and in return, the buccaneers used Port Royal as their base, spending their plunder in the town's taverns, brothels and gambling houses, and providing the island with a formidable, if unreliable, defence force. But before Morgan, there were the original buccaneers, and their story begins on the island of Hispaniola, in the wild, ungoverned western portion that the Spanish had largely abandoned. The word buccaneer comes from the French boucanier, which referred to a method of smoking meat on a wooden frame called a boucan, and the first buccaneers were not pirates at all but hunters, mostly French and some English, who lived on Hispaniola and the nearby island of Tortuga, hunting the wild cattle and pigs that roamed the island's interior and selling the smoked meat to passing ships. These men were outcasts, deserters, escaped servants, and criminals who had fled the rigid social hierarchies of European colonial society and created a rough, egalitarian community in the wilderness of the Caribbean. They called themselves the Brethren of the Coast, and they lived by a code that emphasized personal liberty, shared resources, and mutual aid in a way that would later be formalized in the pirate articles of the Golden Age. When the Spanish authorities tried to eliminate the buccaneers by slaughtering the wild cattle on Hispaniola, thereby destroying their livelihood, the hunters turned to piracy, taking to the sea in small boats and attacking Spanish shipping with a fury that was fueled by a deep and personal hatred of the Spanish crown. Tortuga, a small rocky island off the northern coast of Hispaniola, became the first great pirate base of the Caribbean, a lawless haven where buccaneers of every nationality gathered to plan raids, sell plunder, and enjoy the kind of freedom that existed nowhere else in the colonial world. From Tortuga, the buccaneers launched increasingly ambitious attacks on Spanish ships and settlements, and their growing power and effectiveness attracted the attention of the English and French governments, who saw in the buccaneers a cheap and effective weapon against their Spanish rivals. The greatest of the Port Royal buccaneers was Sir Henry Morgan, a Welshman who led a series of spectacular raids against Spanish colonies that made him the most successful pirate of the 17th century. Morgan's attack on Panama City in 1671, in which he led a force of more than 1,000 buccaneers across the Isthmus of Panama and sacked the richest city in the Americas, was one of the most audacious military operations of the entire era. The raid on Panama was one of the most extraordinary military expeditions of the 17th century. Morgan gathered a force of approximately 2,000 buccaneers at the island of Hispaniola, sailed to the Caribbean coast of Panama, and then led his men on a 9-day march through the dense tropical jungle of the isthmus, hacking through vegetation, fording rivers, and fighting off ambushes by Spanish forces and indigenous warriors. The march was a brutal test of endurance, and the buccaneers, who had brought insufficient provisions, were reduced to eating their own leather satchels and shoe leather to survive. When they finally emerged from the jungle and saw Panama City spread before them, the richest city in the Spanish colonial empire, they attacked with a ferocity born of hunger and desperation. The Spanish defenders, including a force of cavalry and 2 herds of wild bulls that were supposed to stampede into the buccaneers' ranks, were overwhelmed, and the city fell after several hours of bloody fighting. The fire that consumed much of Panama City during the battle, whether set deliberately by the defenders or accidentally by the attackers, destroyed enormous quantities of treasure that the buccaneers had come to steal. And the plunder that Morgan's men did manage to recover was far less than they had expected, leading to bitter disputes over the division of spoils and accusations that Morgan had secretly taken more than his share. He captured so much treasure that it took 175 mules to carry it back across the isthmus. Morgan was briefly arrested and sent to England to face charges, but his political connections were strong enough that he was not only acquitted, but knighted by King Charles II and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, the ultimate poacher turned gamekeeper. Morgan spent his final years enforcing the very laws against piracy that he had spent his career breaking, and he pursued his former colleagues with a zeal that some historians have attributed to genuine conversion, and others to political calculation. He died in 1688, wealthy, powerful, and respected, one of the very few pirates in history to achieve a happy ending. His body was buried with full military honours, and the guns of Port Royal fired a salute as his coffin was lowered into the ground. A few years later, the earthquake that destroyed Port Royal sent his grave sliding into the sea, a poetic end for a man whose life had been so thoroughly shaped by the ocean. A promotion that was essentially a reward for the enormous damage he had inflicted on Spain's colonial empire. Port Royal grew wealthy on pirate plunder, and at its peak in the late 17th century, it was one of the richest and most densely populated cities in the English colonies, with more taverns and brothels per capita than any other city in the Western Hemisphere. The merchants of Port Royal grew rich buying stolen goods from the buccaneers at a fraction of their value, and reselling them on the legitimate market, and the town's reputation for vice and excess attracted adventurers, criminals, and fortune-seekers from across the Atlantic world. Then, on June 7th, 1692, Port Royal was struck by a massive earthquake that liquefied the sandy ground on which the city was built and sent more than 2/3 of the town sliding into the sea. 2,000 people died in the earthquake and its aftermath, and the disaster was widely interpreted as divine punishment for the city's wickedness. Port Royal never recovered, and its role as the centre of Caribbean piracy eventually passed to other ports, including Nassau in the Bahamas, which would become the pirate capital of the Golden Age. The Caribbean, with its hundreds of islands, its thousands of islands ranging from tiny uninhabited cays barely visible above the waterline to large mountainous islands with deep harbours and fresh water, its busy shipping lanes connecting the ports of every European colonial power, and its countless hidden harbours, coves, and inlets where a shallow draft vessel could disappear completely from pursuit. The geography of the Caribbean was perfectly designed for piracy. The trade winds blew predictably from the northeast, pushing sailing vessels westward across the Atlantic and then northwestward through the island chains, which meant that a pirate who understood the wind patterns could position himself along known shipping routes with the certainty that sooner or later a richly laden merchant vessel would come sailing into his trap. The shallow waters around the Bahamas, the mangrove-choked coasts of Cuba and Hispaniola, the labyrinthine waterways of the Leeward and Windward Islands, all of these provided hiding places where a pirate sloop with a shallow draft could duck into water too shallow for the deep-keeled warships of the Royal Navy to follow. The Caribbean was also a crossroads of cultures, a place where English, French, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, African and indigenous peoples mixed and collided in ways that created the diverse polyglot population from which pirate crews were drawn. A typical pirate ship might carry Englishmen, Irishmen, Scotsmen, Welshmen, Frenchmen, Dutchmen, Africans both free and formerly enslaved, mixed-race sailors from every island in the Caribbean, and occasionally Native Americans, all united by the pirate articles and the shared pursuit of plunder, was the perfect hunting ground for these men, and Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, became the unofficial capital of the pirate world during the Golden Age, and for several years in the second decade of the 18th century, it functioned as something very close to an independent pirate republic. The town had been abandoned by its legitimate government after a series of Spanish attacks, and the pirates simply moved in, using the harbour as a base for their operations and governing themselves according to their own rough democratic principles. At its peak, Nassau was home to more than 1,000 pirates, and the harbour was crowded with captured merchant vessels being stripped of their cargoes and refitted for pirate use. The pirates who gathered in Nassau formed a loose confederation that historians have called the Flying Gang, and together they created a community that functioned as a kind of floating democracy in an age of kings and empires. The legendary pirate Benjamin Hornigold, who would later become a pirate hunter for the British, established the first informal pirate government in Nassau, and his protégés included Edward Teach, the future Blackbeard, and Samuel Bellamy, known as Black Sam, who deserves far more attention than he usually receives because his story is one of the most romantic and most tragic of the entire Golden Age. Bellamy earned his nickname because he refused to wear the powdered wigs that were fashionable among other pirate captains, preferring to let his long black hair flow freely behind him. He was known for his egalitarian philosophy, famously declaring that the only difference between himself and the wealthy merchants he robbed was that they robbed the poor under the cover of law, while he robbed the rich under the cover of his own courage. Bellamy was an English sailor who came to Cape Cod around 1715, supposedly to salvage a Spanish treasure wreck, and fell in love with a young woman named Maria Hallett, the daughter of a local farming family. When his salvage expedition failed, Bellamy turned to piracy, reportedly vowing to return to Cape Cod a wealthy man and claim Maria as his bride. Over the next 2 years, he became one of the most successful pirates in the Atlantic, capturing more than 50 ships and accumulating a treasure estimated at the equivalent of more than $100 million in modern currency. His crew loved him because he was fair and generous, and the sailors he captured often chose to join his crew rather than be released, which is how he earned the nickname the Prince of Pirates. Bellamy also earned the nickname Black Sam because he refused to wear the powdered wigs that were fashionable among the wealthy, preferring to tie his long black hair back with a simple ribbon, a choice that was both a personal preference and a political statement about his rejection of the class system that had consigned him to poverty. In April of 1717, Bellamy was sailing north toward Cape Cod, possibly to reunite with Maria Hallett, when his flagship, the Ouida Galley, a former slave ship that he had captured and converted into a heavily armed pirate vessel, was caught in a violent nor'easter off the coast of Wellfleet, Massachusetts. The storm drove the Ouida onto a sandbar where it broke apart in the enormous waves, killing Bellamy and all but 2 of his 146 crew members. Bellamy was 28 years old. The wreck of the Wider lay undiscovered on the ocean floor for nearly 3 centuries until explorer Barry Clifford located it in 1984, and the subsequent excavation recovered more than 200,000 artifacts, including coins, weapons, jewellery, and the ship's bell that positively identified the wreck. It was the first verified pirate shipwreck ever discovered, and the artifacts are now displayed in a museum in Provincetown, Massachusetts, who was one of the most successful pirates of the Golden Age before he and his crew drowned when their ship, the Wider, sank in a storm off Cape Cod in April of 1717. The Wider was discovered by treasure hunters in 1984, and the artifacts recovered from the wreck, including the ship's bell engraved with the name the Wider Galley, provided the first physical evidence of a positively identified pirate shipwreck. The Pirate Republic of Nassau came to an end in 1718 when the British government, alarmed by the threat that piracy posed to colonial trade, sent Captain Woodes Rogers, who was himself a former privateer who had circumnavigated the globe and who had rescued the real-life Robinson Crusoe, a Scottish sailor named Alexander Selkirk, who had been marooned on a Pacific island for 4 years. Rogers was the perfect choice for the Nassau assignment because he understood the pirate mentality from the inside, having lived a life that was not so different from theirs, and he combined a genuine sympathy for the common sailors who had turned to piracy with an iron determination to destroy those who refused to reform. Rogers arrived in Nassau with a small fleet and a garrison of soldiers, and he immediately set about transforming the pirate haven into a functioning colony. He repaired the fort, organised a militia, established courts, and began the slow, difficult work of converting former pirates into productive citizens. The task was immense, because Nassau under the pirates had been a settlement with no agriculture, no industry, and no economy beyond plunder, and building a legitimate society from scratch required patience, resources, and a willingness to use force when persuasion failed. Rogers sent to the Bahamas as the new royal governor, with orders to suppress piracy by whatever means necessary. Rogers arrived with a royal pardon for any pirate who would surrender, and a noose for any pirate who would not, and he pursued both options with equal vigour. Some pirates accepted the pardon, including Hornigold, who switched sides and became one of Rogers' most effective pirate hunters. Others, like Charles Vane, one of the most uncompromising and brutal pirates of the Golden Age, who refused the pardon with spectacular theatricality. When Governor Rogers sailed into Nassau harbour in July of 1718, Vane was anchored in the harbour with a captured French prize ship. Rather than submit, Vane set the French ship on fire and sent it drifting toward Rogers' fleet as a fire ship, a blazing, explosive missile that scattered the governor's vessels and allowed Vane to escape into the open sea. It was one of the most dramatic acts of pirate defiance ever witnessed, and it earned Vane a reputation as a man who would rather burn the world down than surrender to authority. Vane continued to terrorise the Carolina coast and the Caribbean for another year before his crew, dissatisfied with his caution in avoiding a heavily armed French warship, voted to depose him and replace him with Calico Jack Rackham. Vane was set adrift in a small sloop with a handful of loyal followers, and after a series of misadventures that included shipwreck and a period of marooning on an uninhabited island, he was recognised by a passing ship captain, arrested, taken to Jamaica, tried, and hanged in Port Royal in March of 1721. His body was displayed in chains at a point visible from the harbour as a warning to others, as Rogers sailed in, chose to continue their careers, and eventually met the fate that awaited most pirates: capture, trial, and the gallows. It was in the Caribbean that the golden age of piracy reached its full, spectacular, terrifying flower. Now let me tell you about Blackbeard, because no story of American piracy can begin anywhere else. Edward Teach, or Thatch, the man who would become the most famous pirate in history, is shrouded in mystery even 3 centuries after his death. We do not know exactly when or where he was born, though most historians believe he came from Bristol, England, and served as a privateer in the Caribbean during Queen Anne's War before turning to piracy around 1716. What we do know is that within 2 years of his pirate career beginning, Blackbeard had become the most feared man on the Atlantic seaboard, commanding a fleet of 4 ships and several hundred men, and terrorising merchant vessels from the Caribbean to the coast of Virginia, with a ferocity and a flair for the dramatic that made him legendary in his own lifetime. Blackbeard understood, perhaps better than any pirate before or since, that reputation was as powerful a weapon as any cannon. He cultivated his terrifying appearance with deliberate care. He was a tall man, powerfully built with a thick black beard that he braided into multiple plaits and decorated with ribbons. Before going into battle, he would tuck slow-burning fuses into his beard and under his hat so that his head was wreathed in smoke and fire, giving him the appearance of a demon rising from the pit of hell. The effect on his enemies was devastating. Ships surrendered at the mere sight of his flag, a skeleton holding an hourglass in one hand, and a spear pointed at a bleeding heart in the other, because the punishment for piracy was death, and the means of execution was hanging, carried out at Execution Dock in Wapping, London, or at various locations in the colonies where Admiralty courts had jurisdiction. The trials themselves were often perfunctory affairs in which the outcome was largely predetermined, because the legal definition of piracy was broad, and the evidentiary standards were low. A man found aboard a pirate ship could be convicted even if he claimed to have been forced into the pirate crew against his will, unless he could produce witnesses willing to testify on his behalf. And finding such witnesses was understandably difficult when most of the people who might have corroborated your story were your fellow pirates who were themselves facing the gallows. The most spectacular pirate trial of the Golden Age was the mass trial of Bartholomew Roberts' crew at Cape Coast Castle on the coast of West Africa in 1722, where 264 men were tried and 77 were sentenced to death, the largest mass execution of pirates in history. After being hanged, the bodies of prominent pirates were often gibbeted, meaning they were coated in tar to preserve them and displayed in iron cages at the entrance to harbours as a warning to others. These grisly displays could remain in place for years, the bodies slowly disintegrating in the wind and weather, and they were one of the defining images of the maritime world of the 18th century. But despite the severity of the punishment, men continued to choose the pirate life, because for many of them, the alternative to surrender was to face a man who looked like he had been sent directly by Satan to collect their souls. Let me describe the Queen Anne's Revenge for you, because this ship was one of the most formidable pirate vessels ever to sail the Atlantic, and picturing it will help you understand how a single pirate captain could terrorize an entire coastline. The ship had originally been a French slave vessel called La Concorde, a large, fast, well-built ship that Blackbeard captured near the island of Martinique in November of 1717. He immediately recognized the ship's potential as a warship and set about converting it, adding cannon until the ship bristled with 40 guns, enough firepower to challenge all but the most heavily armed warships in the Western Atlantic. With a crew of 300 men, the Queen Anne's Revenge was larger and more heavily armed than most of the Royal Navy vessels stationed in the colonies, which is why the colonial governors were so helpless to stop Blackbeard. The ship was also fast, which was essential for a pirate vessel, because the ability to catch prey and escape pursuers was the difference between wealth and the gallows. Blackbeard sailed the Queen Anne's Revenge for about 6 months before it ran aground on a sandbar near Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, in June of 1718, shortly after the Charlestown blockade. Some historians believe the grounding was deliberate, that Blackbeard intentionally wrecked the ship as part of a scheme to cheat his own crew out of their share of the plunder and reduce his company to a smaller, more manageable number. The wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge was discovered in 1996, and the artefacts recovered from the site, including cannon, anchors, gold dust, medical instruments, and a bell dated 1705, have provided invaluable insights into the material reality of pirate life. A captured French slave ship that he converted into a fearsome warship mounting 40 guns. With this vessel, he dominated the shipping lanes of the Western Atlantic, capturing prize after prize with a combination of intimidation and tactical skill that made him nearly unstoppable. In May of 1718, Blackbeard pulled off one of the most audacious acts in the history of piracy. He sailed his small fleet into the harbour of Charlestown, South Carolina, one of the wealthiest and most important ports in the American colonies, and blockaded the entire city for nearly a week. For 5 days, the most important port in the southern colonies was held hostage by a pirate fleet, and there was nothing the authorities could do about it. The colonial government had no warships, the local militia had no way to attack ships in the harbour, and the Royal Navy was spread thin across the vast Atlantic. Blackbeard exploited this vulnerability with a tactical sophistication that belied his terrifying appearance. He positioned his ships at the mouth of the harbour, where they commanded every approach, and he captured every vessel that tried to enter or leave the harbour, took hostages from among the most prominent citizens of Charlestown, and demanded a ransom, not of gold or silver but of a chest of medicine, which has led historians to speculate that Blackbeard and his crew were suffering from syphilis or some other disease that required mercury-based treatments. The governor of South Carolina had no choice but to comply. There was no naval force available to challenge Blackbeard, and the city was essentially at his mercy. After receiving the medicine, Blackbeard released his hostages and sailed away, leaving Charlestown humiliated and the colonial authorities scrambling to respond. After the Charlestown blockade, Blackbeard sailed north to Bardstown, North Carolina, where he took advantage of a royal pardon that had been offered to any pirate willing to surrender and give up the trade. The relationship between Blackbeard and the colonial government of North Carolina is one of the most fascinating aspects of the pirate era, because it illustrates how deeply piracy was embedded in the economic life of the American colonies. Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina was either one of the most corrupt officials in colonial America or one of the most pragmatic, depending on your perspective. He accepted Blackbeard's surrender and may have actively colluded with the pirate, allowing him to continue his activities in exchange for a share of the profits. North Carolina in 1718 was one of the poorest and most isolated of the American colonies, with few exports, little legitimate trade, and a chronic shortage of imported goods. Blackbeard and his stolen cargoes provided the colony with goods that it could not otherwise obtain, and the pirates' spending helped stimulate an economy that had few other sources of income. Eden was not the only colonial governor to turn a blind eye to piracy when it suited his interests. Throughout the colonial era, governors in the Bahamas, the Carolinas, New York, Rhode Island, and other colonies had maintained mutually profitable relationships with pirates, and the boundary between legal trade and pirate-funded commerce was so porous that it was sometimes impossible to determine where one ended and the other began. The merchants of colonial America, many of them respectable pillars of their communities, routinely bought stolen goods from pirates, fitted out pirate vessels in their shipyards, and provided pirates with the supplies and intelligence they needed to operate. The political impact of piracy on the American colonies was profound and far-reaching. Pirate attacks disrupted trade, raised insurance costs, and created a climate of fear along the coast that affected everything from the price of imported goods to the willingness of settlers to establish communities near the sea. The colonial legislatures spent enormous amounts of time and money on anti-piracy measures, funding coastal fortifications, equipping militia vessels, and lobbying the British government for naval protection. The failure of the British to provide adequate protection against pirates was one of the many grievances that gradually eroded colonial loyalty to the Crown, and the experience of defending themselves against maritime threats helped develop the self-reliance and military capability that would later serve the colonies in their fight for independence. Piracy was not something that happened outside the colonial economy. It was woven into the fabric of colonial commerce, and the wealth it generated helped build some of the most respectable institutions in American society, and may have entered into a corrupt arrangement with the pirate, allowing him to continue his activities in exchange for a share of the profits. Whether or not Eden was complicit, Blackbeard settled in Bardstown and lived openly for several months, even marrying a local woman, his 14th wife according to legend, though the actual number is uncertain. But Blackbeard could not stay retired. By the autumn of 1718 he was back at sea, preying on coastal shipping, and the merchants and planters of the Carolina coast were desperate for someone to stop him. The man who finally brought Blackbeard down was Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy, who was sent from Virginia with 2 small sloops to find and destroy the pirate. Maynard tracked Blackbeard to his anchorage at Ocracoke Inlet on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and on the morning of November 22nd, 1718, the two forces met in one of the most famous naval engagements in American history. The battle was brief, brutal, and extraordinarily violent. Blackbeard's ship fired a devastating broadside at Maynard's sloop, killing or wounding more than a third of the crew, and when Blackbeard led a boarding party onto the sloop, let me describe what a pirate battle actually looked like, because the reality was very different from the elegant sword fights of the movies. When a pirate ship closed with its prey, the first phase of the engagement was an exchange of cannon fire, with the pirates aiming not at the hull of the target vessel, but at its masts, rigging, and sails, trying to cripple the ship's ability to maneuver and escape without sinking it. Since a sunken ship and its cargo were worthless to the pirates used a variety of ammunition designed to destroy rigging, including chain shot, 2 cannonballs connected by a length of chain that whirled through the air like a giant bowler, and bar shot, 2 half cannonballs connected by an iron bar. Once the target was disabled, the pirates would pull alongside, throw grappling hooks to hold the 2 ships together, and board. The boarding party was armed to the teeth. Each man typically carried a cutlass, the short, heavy, slightly curved sword that was the signature weapon of the maritime world, along with 1 or more flintlock pistols, a knife, and sometimes a boarding axe. The cutlass was preferred over the rapier or small sword because its heavy blade could hack through rigging and wood as easily as flesh, and its short length made it practical in the cramped spaces of a ship's deck. The flintlock pistol was a single-shot weapon that took 30 seconds or more to reload, so most pirates carried multiple pistols, firing each one once and then using it as a club. Grenades, made from glass bottles or coconut shells filled with gunpowder and bits of metal, were thrown onto the enemy deck before boarding to create confusion and casualties. The fighting was brutal and close-quartered, with the fighting was hand-to-hand with cutlasses and pistols at point-blank range. Maynard and Blackbeard fought face-to-face, and according to the most detailed contemporary accounts, Blackbeard received 5 musket balls and more than 20 sword wounds before he finally fell dead on the deck. Maynard cut off Blackbeard's head and hung it from the bowsprit of his sloop as proof of the kill, and legend has it that the battle at Ocracoke has been reconstructed in extraordinary detail by historians using the accounts of Maynard and his surviving crew. Maynard had hidden most of his men below decks, and when Blackbeard's boarding party swarmed over the rail, expecting to find a ship crewed by dead and dying men, they were met by a sudden rush of armed sailors who erupted from the holds like a trap springing shut. The fighting was savage and chaotic, fought in the confined space of the sloop's deck with the 2 ships lashed together and the water of Ocracoke Inlet churning beneath them. Maynard and Blackbeard faced each other directly, and both men fired their pistols at close range. Maynard's shot hit Blackbeard but did not stop him, and Blackbeard's cutlass stroke was so powerful that it snapped Maynard's sword at the hilt. Before Blackbeard could deliver a killing blow, one of Maynard's men slashed the pirate across the throat from behind, and the rest of the crew closed in, hacking and shooting until the most feared man in the Atlantic finally went down. The examination of Blackbeard's body after the battle revealed just how hard he had been to kill. He had sustained 5 gunshot wounds and more than 20 deep cuts from swords and knives, any one of which might have been fatal to a lesser man. Legend has it that Blackbeard's headless body, when thrown overboard, swam 3 times around the ship before sinking beneath the waves. The head was later mounted on a pole at the entrance to Hampton Roads, Virginia, as a warning to other pirates, and Blackbeard's legend, already enormous in life, grew even larger in death. Before I move on from Blackbeard, though, let me tell you about a pirate who was arguably even more successful, even if his name is less well known today. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, was a Welsh sailor who was captured by pirates in 1719, and within weeks had been elected captain of the very crew that had captured him, a testament to his natural leadership abilities and his obvious competence as a seaman. Over the next 3 years, Roberts captured more than 400 ships, a number that dwarfs the accomplishments of every other pirate in the Golden Age. He was a paradoxical figure, a pirate who did not drink alcohol, who dressed in fine crimson silk and wore a diamond-encrusted cross around his neck, who insisted on observing the Sabbath aboard his ship, and who treated his prisoners with a courtesy that was unusual among pirates, unless they came from Barbados or Martinique, whose governors had particularly aggressive anti-piracy policies, in which case Roberts treated them with exceptional cruelty as a matter of principle. Roberts' Articles of Agreement, which have survived in the historical record, are every man had the right to vote on major decisions, including where to sail, whether to attack a particular ship, and how to divide the plunder. The captain was elected by majority vote and could be removed by the same process if the crew felt he was not performing adequately, which happened more often than you might expect. The quartermaster, who was also elected, served as a kind of counterbalance to the captain, handling the distribution of food, settling disputes among the crew, and representing the interests of the common sailors. This system of checks and balances, crude as it was, predated many of the democratic reforms that would later transform the governments of Europe, and some historians have argued that pirate ships were among the most democratic institutions of their time. The Articles also established a primitive form of disability insurance, specifying exact payments for specific injuries. The loss of a right arm was worth 600 pieces of 8 on most ships, while a left arm merited 500, a right leg 500, a left leg 400, and the loss of an eye or a finger 100. These compensation schedules varied from crew to crew, but the principle was consistent across the pirate world, and it speaks to a kind of rough social contract that was remarkably progressive for the era. The most detailed and elaborate pirate code known to historians and provide a remarkable window into the social organisation of a pirate crew. They specified everything from the distribution of plunder to the hours at which the ship's lights would be extinguished, and they included provisions for compensation of injured crew members that were startlingly progressive for the era, including the equivalent of 800 pieces of 8 for the loss of a limb. Roberts was killed by grapeshot during a battle with the Royal Navy warship HMS Swallow off the coast of West Africa in February of 1722, and his crew, following his standing orders, threw his body overboard in his finest clothes so that it would never be displayed by the authorities. His death is often cited as the moment that marked the end of the golden age of piracy, because after Roberts, no pirate captain would ever again command a fleet large enough or powerful enough to challenge the naval forces of the European powers. But Blackbeard was only one of many pirates who terrorized the American coast during the Golden Age, and some of the others were equally remarkable. But first, let me tell you about one of the strangest pirates of the Golden Age, a man whose story is so improbable that it sounds like fiction, but is entirely true. Steder Bonnet was a wealthy Barbados plantation owner, a man of education and social standing, a retired army major, and a husband and father who, in the year 1717, for reasons that have never been adequately explained, bought a ship, hired a crew, and sailed off to become a pirate. He had no maritime experience whatsoever. He did not know how to navigate, he could barely sail, and his crew quickly realised that their captain was completely incompetent. Bonnet's early career was a string of modest successes and near disasters, and he might have been forgotten entirely if he had not crossed paths with Blackbeard, who took the gentleman pirate under his wing in a relationship that was somewhere between mentorship and exploitation. Blackbeard essentially took command of Bonnet's ship while allowing Bonnet to remain aboard as a passenger, and the two sailed together for several months before Blackbeard eventually swindled Bonnet out of his ship and most of his crew. Bonnet, humiliated but undeterred, acquired a new vessel, renamed himself Captain Thomas, and resumed his pirate career with a determination that was admirable if not entirely sane. He was eventually captured by a pirate hunting expedition, led by Colonel William Rhett near the mouth of the Cape Fear River in North Carolina in September of 1718, tried for piracy in Charlestown, and hanged in December of that year, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers, according to one account, as the noose was placed around his neck. His story has fascinated historians for 3 centuries, because it defies the usual explanations for why men turned to piracy. Bonnet was not poor, not desperate, not a victim of circumstance. He was a wealthy, comfortable man who chose to become a pirate, and no one, then or now, has been able to explain why. Some historians have speculated that he was fleeing an unhappy marriage, others that he suffered from some kind of mental breakdown, and the contemporary record notes only that his mind was disturbed. Let me tell you about Bonny and Mary Read, 2 women whose stories are among the most extraordinary in the entire history of piracy. Bonny was born in Ireland, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer, and came to America as a child when her father moved the family to Charlestown, South Carolina. She grew up in the colonial port city of Charlestown, surrounded by the wealth of the plantation economy and the rough energy of a major shipping hub. Local legend held that she stabbed a servant girl with a table knife when she was 13, and while the truth of this story is uncertain, it captures the personality that contemporaries attributed to her, a woman of fierce independence and violent temper who refused to be constrained by the expectations that colonial society placed on women. Her father, William Cormack, had become a successful plantation owner in South Carolina, and Anne might have lived a comfortable life as a planter's daughter if she had been willing to accept the role that society assigned her. Instead, she married James Bonny against her father's wishes, was disinherited, and found herself in Nassau, the pirate capital, at the exact moment when the Golden Age was at its height. It was there that she met Calico Jack Rackham, and it was there that she discovered that life aboard a pirate ship offered a freedom that no woman in colonial America could find on land. She grew up wild and fierce, with a temper that was legendary even before she turned to piracy. She married a small-time sailor named James Bonny, but quickly grew bored with him and ran off with Calico Jack Rackham, a pirate captain known for his colourful calico clothing and his relatively modest career of coastal raiding. Anne sailed with Calico Jack as a full member of his crew, fighting alongside the men and, according to contemporary accounts, fighting better than most of them. Mary Read had an even more remarkable backstory. Mary Read's life story is one of the most extraordinary in the annals of piracy, and it reads like something out of an 18th century novel, which is perhaps why Daniel Defoe, if he was indeed the author of Johnson's General History, found it so compelling. She had been raised as a boy by her mother, a deception that began in her infancy and continued throughout her childhood. Her mother had lost a legitimate son, and needing to collect the inheritance that was due to the boy from his grandmother, dressed the surviving illegitimate daughter in boy's clothing and presented her as the dead child. Mary grew up as a boy, learned to fight as a boy, and eventually joined the army as a boy, serving in the Flemish campaigns with such distinction that her fellow soldiers never suspected her sex. She fell in love with a Flemish soldier, revealed her identity to him, and the two married and opened a tavern called the Three Horseshoes near the castle of Breda in the Netherlands. But her husband died young, and Mary, with no means of support and no desire to return to the constraints of women's life in the early 18th century, resumed her male disguise, joined the crew of a Dutch merchant vessel bound for the Caribbean, and eventually found herself aboard Calico Jack Rackham's pirate ship, where she met Anne Bonny and formed one of the most famous partnerships in pirate history. The two women recognised each other's sex almost immediately and became close allies, fighting side by side in battles and standing together when the rest of the crew proved cowardly. Who was trying to pass her off as her deceased older brother in order to collect an inheritance? Mary served as a soldier in the British Army, fighting in Flanders, before eventually making her way to the Caribbean, where she joined Calico Jack's crew, possibly without anyone initially realising she was a woman. When Calico Jack's ship was captured by a pirate hunter named Jonathan Barnett in October of 1720, Barnett's sloop attacked at night, finding Rackham's vessel anchored in a small bay off the western coast of Jamaica. The pirate crew had been celebrating a successful capture with a rum punch party, and most of the men were so drunk that they could barely stand, let alone fight. When Barnett's vessel opened fire with a cannon volley that shredded the rigging and sent splinters flying across the deck, the male pirates stumbled below decks to hide, leaving only Anne Bonny and Mary Read on deck to face the attackers. The two women fired pistols at the approaching vessel, slashed at boarders with cutlasses, and reportedly fired a shot down into the hold where the men were cowering, killing one of their own crew in fury at their cowardice. But two fighters, no matter how brave, could not hold off an entire ship's company, and the pirates were taken without significant further resistance. The trial of Calico Jack's crew in November of 1720 became one of the most famous trials in pirate history, largely because of the sensational testimony about the two female pirates, whose presence aboard the ship fascinated the public and confounded the prosecutors, who were unsure how to deal with women in a legal system designed exclusively for male pirates. In the end, the only members of the crew who put up a fight were Anne Bonny and Mary Read. The men, most of them drunk below decks, surrendered without resistance, and Anne reportedly told Calico Jack as he was being led to the gallows that if he had fought like a man, he would not have had to die like a dog. Both women escaped hanging by claiming to be pregnant, a legal protection known as pleading the belly that temporarily stayed execution until the child was born. Mary Read died in prison, probably of fever, but Anne Bonny simply disappeared from the historical record after her trial, and her ultimate fate remains one of the enduring mysteries of the pirate era. Now let me take you to a different kind of piracy, because the pirates of the Caribbean were not the only ones who shaped American history. The Barbary pirates of North Africa, operating from the ports of Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli and Morocco, had been raiding European shipping and enslaving European captives for centuries, and when the newly independent United States began trading in the Mediterranean after the American Revolution, American ships and sailors became targets as well. The Barbary crisis was one of the first foreign policy challenges faced by the new republic, and it played a crucial role in the creation of the United States Navy. Before independence, American ships had been protected by the British Royal Navy, but after 1783 that protection was gone, and the Barbary states wasted no time in exploiting the vulnerability. The experience of the enslaved American sailors in North Africa was harrowing, and the accounts left by those who survived provide some of the most vivid descriptions of captivity in the literature of the early republic. The sailors were typically put to work as labourers, hauling stones for construction projects, rowing galleys, or performing domestic service in the households of wealthy North Africans. They were subject to beatings, starvation, and the constant psychological torment of knowing that their freedom depended on the willingness of their distant government to pay a ransom that might never come. Some captives converted to Islam, either sincerely or as a survival strategy, and those who did were sometimes granted their freedom and the opportunity to build new lives in North Africa. Others languished in captivity for years, watching their fellow prisoners die of disease, maltreatment, and despair. The public outcry over the Barbary captives was intense, and the newspaper stories, published letters, and congressional debates about the fate of the enslaved sailors played a significant role in building public support for the creation of a strong navy. American merchant ships were captured, their crews enslaved, and the fledgling nation was humiliated by its inability to protect its own citizens on the high seas. The United States initially tried to solve the problem by paying tribute, essentially protection money, to the Barbary states, and the amounts were staggering, consuming at one point roughly 1/5 of the entire federal budget. The tribute payments were deeply unpopular and widely seen as a national disgrace, and when the Pasha of Tripoli declared war on the United States in 1801 by cutting down the American flag at the consulate, President Thomas Jefferson sent the Navy to the Mediterranean to fight back. The story of how the United States went from paying tribute to fighting back is one of the most dramatic chapters in early American history, and it deserves careful attention as you settle deeper into your pillow. The Barbary corsairs were not ragtag pirates in the traditional sense, but well-organised naval forces operating under the authority of the North African states, which were technically provinces of the Ottoman Empire but in practice functioned as independent principalities. Their ships were fast and well-armed, their crews were skilled and experienced, and their primary source of revenue was the capture and enslavement of Christian sailors and passengers, who were held for ransom or put to work as galley slaves, construction labourers, or domestic servants. The scale of Barbary slavery was enormous. Historians estimate that between 1 and 1.25 million Europeans were enslaved by the Barbary states between the 16th and 19th centuries, making it one of the largest and longest-running slave trades in history. American sailors were a tiny fraction of this total, but the humiliation of having American citizens enslaved by a foreign power, and the financial burden of paying tribute to prevent further captures, was intolerable to a nation that had just fought a revolution in the name of liberty. The debate over how to respond to the Barbary threat played a significant role in the early political conflicts of the Republic. Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists argued for building a strong navy that could project American power overseas, while Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, who generally favoured a small government and a minimal military, found themselves confronting the reality that American commerce could not be protected without naval force. It was one of the great ironies of early American history that Jefferson, the champion of limited government, ended up authorizing the military action that established the United States as a naval power in the Mediterranean. The First Barbary War, which lasted from 1801 to 1805, was a formative experience for the young American military and produced several of the early Republic's greatest heroes. The Barbary Wars produced some of the most dramatic moments in early American naval history, and the names of the men who fought them became legends in their own time. Stephen Decatur was 25 years old when he volunteered to lead a mission that everyone involved knew might be suicidal. The American frigate Philadelphia had been captured intact by Tripolitanian forces when it ran aground on a reef in Tripoli harbour, and the Pasha was using the ship's guns to defend the harbour and holding the ship's 300 officers and crew as prisoners. Decatur and a crew of about 75 volunteers sailed a captured Tripolitanian vessel, renamed the Intrepid, directly into Tripoli harbour under cover of darkness, pulled alongside the Philadelphia, boarded her, overwhelmed the Tripolitanian guards in hand-to-hand combat, set the ship ablaze, and escaped in their small boat while the burning frigate lit up the harbour like a bonfire. The entire operation took less than 20 minutes, and not a single American was killed. The raid made Decatur a national hero at the age of 25, and his later career included further heroics in the War of 1812, where he captured the British frigate HMS Macedonian in one of the most celebrated ship-to-ship actions of the war, and in the Second Barbary War of 1815, where he forced the Dey of Algiers to sign a treaty ending the payment of tribute. Decatur was killed in a duel in 1820 at the age of 41, one of the most prominent Americans to die in that peculiar institution of honour-based violence, and his famous toast, "Our country, right or wrong, became one of the most quoted phrases in American history. Into Tripoli Harbor to burn the captured American frigate Philadelphia rather than allow it to be used against the American fleet became one of the most celebrated figures in American history, and Horatio Nelson reportedly called the raid the most bold and daring act of the age. The Marines' hymn, with its famous opening line about the shores of Tripoli, commemorates a military adventure that sounds like something out of a movie script but actually happened. William Eaton, the American consul to Tunis, conceived a plan to overthrow the Pasha of Tripoli by supporting his exiled brother, Hamet Karamanli, who was willing to cooperate with the Americans in exchange for being restored to power. Eaton assembled a motley force of about 500 men, including 8 United States Marines under the command of Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, a handful of midshipmen from the American fleet, and several hundred Arab and Berber mercenaries whose loyalty was uncertain at best, and marched this improbable army across 600 miles of Libyan desert from Alexandria, Egypt, to the coastal city of Derna. The march took nearly 2 months and was a nightmarish ordeal of thirst, sandstorms, near mutinies, and the constant threat of attack by hostile Bedouin tribes. When the force finally reached Derna, Eaton led the assault on the city, supported by naval gunfire from American warships offshore, and the attack succeeded against all odds. Lieutenant O'Bannon planted the American flag on the walls of Derna's fortress, the first time the Stars and Stripes had been raised over a foreign fortification, and the victory, combined with the naval blockade of Tripoli, forced the Pasha to negotiate a peace treaty that ended the payment of tribute. The expedition to Derna was to capture the city of Derna, one of the most improbable military operations in American history. Let me now take you forward in time to another uniquely American pirate, Jean Lafitte, whose story blurs every boundary between piracy and patriotism, between crime and heroism, between legend and history. Jean Lafitte was a Frenchman, probably born around 1780, who established himself in the early 1800s as the leader of a smuggling and piracy operation based at Barataria Bay, a maze of bayous, islands, and waterways south of New Orleans that was virtually impenetrable to outsiders. Lafitte was not a pirate in the traditional sense. He preferred to call himself a privateer, and he always insisted that he never attacked American vessels, only Spanish ones, and only under the authority of letters of marque issued by the Republic of Cartagena, a short-lived revolutionary state in what is now Colombia. Whether his legal justifications held any water was debatable, but Lafitte maintained the fiction with a lawyer's precision and a showman's flair. He was by all accounts a remarkably charismatic man, tall, handsome, multilingual, and possessed of a personal magnetism that attracted followers from every corner of the Gulf Coast. His base at Barataria Bay was a small empire unto itself, a hidden world of warehouses, slave pens, repair docks, and living quarters built among the bayous and barrier islands south of New Orleans, accessible only through a labyrinth of waterways that Lafitte and his men knew intimately, and that made the settlement virtually impregnable to attack by conventional naval forces. At its peak, the Barataria community included perhaps 1,000 men, many of them experienced sailors and fighters drawn from the diverse populations of the Caribbean, French, Spanish, American, African, and mixed-race men who found in Lafitte's operation an opportunity and a freedom that the legitimate world denied them. Lafitte and his brother Pierre ran a sophisticated criminal enterprise that combined piracy, smuggling, slave trading, and fencing stolen goods into a business operation that was as profitable as it was illegal. Lafitte's men preyed on Spanish and British shipping in the Gulf of Mexico, and the goods they captured, everything from silk and spices to enslaved human beings, were sold through a network of warehouses and markets that served as an alternative economy for the entire region. The American authorities tried repeatedly to shut down the Barataria operation, and in September of 1814, a naval force attacked and destroyed the settlement at Barataria Bay. But just weeks later, the British approached Lafitte with an offer of $30,000, a commission in the Royal Navy, and full pardons for his men if he would help them in their planned attack on New Orleans during the War of 1812. Lafitte refused the British offer and instead went to the Americans, offering his men his knowledge of the local waterways and his considerable supply of arms and ammunition to General Andrew Jackson in exchange for pardons. Jackson, who had initially called Lafitte and his men hellish banditti, accepted the offer when he realized how desperately he needed the manpower and the flints and powder that Lafitte could provide. The weeks leading up to the Battle of New Orleans were among the most dramatic in American military history, and Lafitte's role in the events was straight out of a novel. Andrew Jackson, the commanding general of American forces in the Gulf region, was a man of fierce determination and even fiercer prejudices, and he initially wanted nothing to do with the Barratarians, calling them pirates and outlaws who deserved the gallows rather than pardons. But Jackson was desperately short of manpower, arms and ammunition, and when Lafitte offered not only hundreds of experienced fighters, but also thousands of flints for muskets, enough gunpowder to supply an entire army, and an intimate knowledge of the bayous and waterways that the British might use to approach New Orleans, pragmatism won out over principle. The Barratarians proved their worth spectacularly. Lafitte's men, many of them experienced artillerists who had spent years manning the cannon on their pirate vessels, were assigned to key artillery batteries along the American defensive line, and their precise, devastating fire played a crucial role in repelling the British assault. The battle itself was a catastrophic defeat for the British, who lost more than 2,000 men killed, wounded or captured in a frontal assault against Jackson's fortified position, while the Americans suffered fewer than 70 casualties. It was one of the most lopsided victories in the history of warfare, and the Barratarians' contribution was acknowledged by Jackson himself, who praised their courage and skill in his official report. The irony of the entire episode was profound. Jean Lafitte, the pirate king of the Gulf Coast, had saved the city of New Orleans and possibly changed the course of American history, and for a brief moment, the line between pirate and patriot disappeared completely. The Battle of New Orleans, fought on January 8, 1815, was one of the most decisive American victories in the War of 1812, and Lafitte's Barratarians played a significant role, manning artillery batteries that helped repel the British assault. After the battle, President James Madison issued pardons to Lafitte and his men, and Jean Lafitte briefly enjoyed the status of a national hero. But Lafitte could not stay respectable any more than Blackbeard could. Within a few years, he had established a new base on Galveston Island, off the coast of Texas, and resumed his pirating and smuggling operations. The Galveston settlement, which Lafitte called Campeche, and it was one of the strangest communities in the history of the Americas. The settlement consisted of several hundred buildings, including Lafitte's own residence, a grand red-painted house that the locals called the Maison Rouge, which served as both his personal quarters and his headquarters. Campeche had its own government, its own laws, and its own economy, all of it ultimately controlled by Lafitte, who ruled with a combination of charisma, intelligence, and occasional ruthlessness that kept his diverse population of pirates, smugglers, and refugees in line. The settlement's primary business was the capture and sale of Spanish merchant vessels, but Lafitte also trafficked in enslaved people, buying them from slave ships captured in the Gulf of Mexico and smuggling them into the United States through the bayous and back channels of Louisiana and Texas, circumventing the ban on the importation of slaves that had been in effect since 1808. This aspect of Lafitte's career is far less romantic than the patriot pirate image that has been cultivated by Louisiana tourism boards and adventure novelists, and it serves as a reminder that the pirate life, for all its appeal to the modern imagination, was built on exploitation and suffering as much as on freedom and adventure. Campeche was destroyed by a hurricane in 1818 and never fully recovered, and when the United States Navy arrived in 1821 to demand that Lafitte vacate the island, he complied without resistance, burning the settlement behind him as he sailed away. It was, with its own laws and government and a population that included pirates, smugglers, deserters, refugees, and adventurers from every corner of the Atlantic world. Lafitte ruled Campeche for several years before the United States Navy finally forced him to leave in 1821, and he sailed away into the Gulf of Mexico and vanished from the historical record as completely as Anne Bonny had a century before. The legends say he buried treasure on Galveston Island and at various other locations along the Gulf Coast, and the idea of buried pirate treasure is one of the most persistent legends in American culture, and it deserves a moment of examination because the reality is far more interesting than the fantasy. The truth is that very few pirates ever buried their treasure, for the simple reason that most pirates spent their plunder as fast as they acquired it. The culture of pirate ships was rich and surprisingly sophisticated. Music was a constant presence aboard pirate vessels, and most pirate crews included at least one musician, often a fiddler, whose duties included providing entertainment during the long stretches between prizes and playing martial music during battles to keep morale high. Pirate musicians were so valued that they were often exempted from combat duties, and some musicians captured from merchant vessels were forced to serve on pirate ships specifically for their abilities. The sea songs and shanties that evolved in the maritime world of the 17th and 18th centuries were the soundtrack of pirate life, work songs that helped coordinate the rhythmic labour of hauling ropes and raising anchors, and leisure songs that told stories of adventure, love, and loss. Storytelling was another essential element of pirate culture, and the tales pirates told each other during long nights at sea, stories of legendary prizes, narrow escapes, buried treasure, and fallen comrades, formed an oral tradition that eventually found its way into books and ballads that shaped public perception of piracy for centuries. Pirates also had their own superstitions, many borrowed from the broader maritime world. They believed that whistling on deck could summon a storm, that killing an albatross brought terrible luck, that women aboard ship were bad omens, though this belief did not prevent Bonny and Mary Read from sailing, and that the ghosts of drowned sailors haunted the waters where they had perished. The reality was that the pirate life was unpredictable and often short, and the men who lived it had little incentive to save for a future that might never arrive. When a pirate ship captured a prize, the plunder was divided among the crew according to the articles, and the men typically spent their shares within days or weeks at the nearest port, drinking, gambling, and enjoying the company of the establishments that catered to their appetites. A pirate crew that captured a rich prize might blow through the equivalent of a year's wages in a single wild weekend in Nassau or Port Royal or Tortuga, and then go back to sea looking for the next prize. The legend of buried treasure derives largely from the story of Captain Kidd, who reportedly buried a portion of his treasure on Gardiner's Island before his arrest, and from Robert Louis Stevenson's novel Treasure Island, published in 1883, which created the definitive fictional image of buried pirate gold, complete with treasure maps marked with an X. In reality, the only pirate known with certainty to have buried treasure was Kidd, and most of what he buried was recovered by the authorities shortly after his arrest. The far more common fate of pirate treasure was to be spent, lost, or captured by the authorities, and the vast majority of the wealth that pirates accumulated over 3 centuries has long since been absorbed into the economies of the ports and cities where it was spent. But the legend persists, and there are still people today searching for the treasure of Jean Lafitte, the lost gold of the Wider, and the hidden hoards of a dozen other legendary pirates, driven by the same irresistible dream that has drawn treasure hunters to the American coast for 300 years, without success. Let me take you now to the end of the pirate era in American waters, because piracy did not disappear overnight. It evolved and adapted and persisted in various forms well into the 19th century. The end of the Golden Age did not mean the end of piracy in American waters, far from it. Piracy continued in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico throughout the 18th and into the 19th century, though its character changed significantly. The great pirate captains with their fleets and their flags gave way to smaller, more opportunistic operators who worked in fast, lightly armed vessels and preyed on local shipping, rather than attempting the grand-scale plunder of the Golden Age. The coast of Cuba, with its hundreds of miles of mangrove-lined shoreline and its proximity to the major shipping lanes, was particularly infested with pirates well into the 1820s, and the United States Navy established a dedicated anti-piracy squadron, the West India Squadron under Commodore David Porter, specifically to suppress piracy in the Caribbean. Porter's campaign, which lasted from 1823 to 1825, was a systematic effort to clear the pirates from every island, inlet and harbour in the region, and it involved not only traditional warships, but also a fleet of small, shallow draft vessels that could pursue the pirates into the coastal waters where they hid. The campaign was largely successful, though it came at a high cost in lives lost to yellow fever and other tropical diseases, and it established the principle that the United States would use naval force to protect the freedom of navigation in the Western Hemisphere. The waters around Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the coast of Central America remained dangerous long after the Golden Age had ended, and American naval vessels spent decades patrolling the Caribbean to protect merchant shipping from pirates who operated from hidden harbours and remote islands. The pirates who operated in the Caribbean in the 1820s were a far cry from the colourful captains of the Golden Age. They were mostly desperate men, former sailors and fishermen, and escaped criminals who preyed on the small merchant vessels that traded between the islands, and their methods were often more brutal than those of their predecessors because they could not afford to leave witnesses alive to identify them. The American naval campaign against these later pirates was complicated by the political situation in the Caribbean, where the Spanish colonies were in the process of fighting for their independence, and the distinction between pirate, privateer, and revolutionary naval officer was as blurred as it had been 2 centuries earlier. The most notorious of these later pirates was Charles Gibbs, a New England sailor who became one of the last men hanged for piracy in the United States, executed in New York in 1831 after a career that included the murder of fellow sailors, the plunder of merchant vessels, and a confession that was published as a penny pamphlet and became a bestseller. The end of piracy in American waters was brought about not by any single event, but by the gradual extension of naval power, the improvement of communications, the growth of international cooperation in policing the seas, particularly the partnership between the British Royal Navy and the United States Navy, that transformed the Atlantic from a pirate hunting ground into a relatively safe commercial highway. The Royal Navy's campaign against piracy in the Caribbean during the 1720s, which included the deployment of dedicated anti-piracy squadrons, the hanging of hundreds of convicted pirates, and the appointment of aggressive governors like Woodes Rogers, was one of the most effective law enforcement campaigns in history, and it effectively destroyed the organised piracy of the Golden Age within a decade. The success of this campaign owed much to the intelligence networks that the colonial authorities developed, including the use of informants within pirate crews, the interrogation of captured pirates, and the systematic tracking of pirate movements through reports from merchant captains and colonial officials. The British also employed a strategy of pardons and amnesties, offering pirates the chance to surrender and go straight in exchange for immunity from prosecution, a carrot-and-stick approach that proved remarkably effective at thinning the pirate ranks and turning former pirates into pirate hunters. And the simple economic fact that the world was becoming too well connected and too well patrolled for piracy to remain profitable. The last great wave of American maritime lawlessness was not piracy in the traditional sense, but something equally dramatic. Let me talk about the connection between piracy and slavery, because the two are deeply intertwined in ways that most pirate stories conveniently overlook. Many pirate ships operated in the same waters as slave ships, and some pirates, including Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Jean Lafitte, captured slave ships and dealt in enslaved human beings as part of their operations. The Wider, Samuel Bellamy's flagship, had been a slave ship before Bellamy captured it, and when it sank off Cape Cod, it was carrying both pirate treasure and the physical evidence of its former use in the slave trade. But the relationship between piracy and slavery was not simply one of exploitation. Many pirate crews included significant numbers of formerly enslaved Africans who had been freed from captured slave ships, and who chose to join the pirates rather than face re-enslavement. Some pirate ships had crews that were 1/4 to 1/3 black, and while racism certainly existed in the pirate world, the colour line was often less rigidly enforced aboard a pirate vessel than in any other institution in the Atlantic world. Black pirates served as ordinary crew members, as skilled specialists, and in some cases as officers, and they received equal shares of plunder under the pirate articles. This relative equality was one of the things that made piracy so threatening to the colonial social order, because it demonstrated that the rigid racial hierarchies of the plantation colonies were not natural or inevitable, but were maintained only by force and custom. The sight of black men armed and fighting as equals alongside white men on a pirate ship was profoundly unsettling to the plantation owners and colonial governors who depended on the subordination of Africans for their wealth and power. And it is one of the reasons why the colonial authorities pursued pirates with such ferocity, because piracy threatened not just trade, but the entire social order on which colonial wealth depended. Now let me tell you about the era of the slave trade. After the United States outlawed the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, the trade continued illegally for decades, carried on by men who used every trick and technique that the pirates of the Golden Age had pioneered. The illegal slave ships were fast, heavily armed, and commanded by captains who were as ruthless and resourceful as any pirate who had ever sailed. They sailed under false flags, carried forged papers, and employed lookouts to watch for the naval patrols that were supposed to enforce the ban. When intercepted, they sometimes threw their human cargo overboard to destroy the evidence, a practice so horrific that it prompted the British and American navies to intensify their patrols and eventually to classify the slave trade itself as a form of piracy, punishable by death. The Africa Squadron, established by the United States Navy in 1842 to patrol the West African coast and intercept slave ships, was one of the last iterations of the anti-piracy mission that had begun with the suppression of Blackbeard more than a century earlier. The connection between piracy and the slave trade came full circle in these final decades. Ships that had begun their lives carrying enslaved people to the Americas had been captured by pirates and converted into warships during the Golden Age. And now, a century later, ships that operated like pirate vessels were carrying enslaved people back across the same ocean in defiance of the law. The Atlantic was a circle of violence and exploitation that connected Africa, Europe, and the Americas in a web of commerce, cruelty, and resistance that lasted for more than 3 centuries, and piracy was woven through every strand of that web. Sailing under false flags, using secret harbours, and employing every trick of evasion that the pirates of the Golden Age had perfected a century earlier. The illegal slave trade was enormously profitable, and the men who engaged in it were willing to accept the same risks that pirates had always faced, because the potential rewards were so great. As you lie here in the darkness, letting these stories of salt water and cannon fire settle into the quiet corners of your mind, think about what the pirates of America really were. They were not the romantic figures of Hollywood fantasy, though some of them were certainly romantic in their way. They were products of their time, men and women shaped by the brutal economics of the Atlantic world, by the endless wars between European empires, by the crushing poverty that drove ordinary sailors to risk the gallows for a chance at a better life. The economics of piracy deserve careful examination because they reveal the true forces that drove men to the pirate life. A common sailor in the Royal Navy in the early 18th century earned about £1 per month, payable only at the end of a voyage that might last years, and he could be flogged for minor infractions, pressed into service against his will, and fed food that was barely fit for animals. A merchant sailor earned slightly more but worked under conditions that were nearly as harsh, with the added risk that his wages might be withheld by a dishonest captain, or that the ship might be lost at sea with no compensation for his family. A pirate, by contrast, could earn in a single successful voyage what a legitimate sailor might earn in a lifetime. The captured treasure from a single rich prize, divided among a crew of 100 men, could give each man the equivalent of 20 years' wages. The risk was enormous, the life expectancy was short, and the punishment, if caught, was death. But for men whose legitimate options offered only poverty, abuse, and an early grave, the pirate life represented a rational economic calculation. Many of them were former naval sailors who had seen their comrades flogged to the bone for trivial offences, who had watched captains grow rich while the men who did the actual work received barely enough to survive, by officers who held the power of life and death over their crews. Many were former slaves or escaped servants. Many were simply men who looked at the world they had been born into and decided that the risks of piracy were preferable to the certainty of poverty and exploitation. Let me take you aboard a pirate ship now, because the reality of daily life on a pirate vessel is far more interesting than the Hollywood version, and understanding it helps explain why men chose this life, despite the almost certainty that it would end in a violent death. The ships that pirates used were as varied as the pirates themselves, but certain types were preferred for the demands of the pirate trade. The ideal pirate ship was fast, manoeuvrable, and shallow-drafted, capable of outsailing most pursuers and ducking into coastal waters too shallow for larger warships. The sloop, a single-masted vessel that was quick and handy, was the most common pirate ship in the Caribbean, and many of the most successful pirates, including Blackbeard in his early career and Calico Jack Rackham, used sloops. The brigantine, a 2-masted vessel that combined speed with greater carrying capacity, was another popular choice. Larger pirate captains, those who commanded fleets or who had captured particularly fine vessels, sometimes operated frigates or converted merchant ships that could mount dozens of cannon and carry crews of 200 or more, but these larger vessels were harder to maintain and more conspicuous, which made them targets for the Royal Navy. The pirates acquired their ships through capture, theft, and occasionally purchase, and they modified them extensively for their purposes, cutting additional gun ports, removing unnecessary internal structures to create more space for crew and plunder, and sometimes painting them in distinctive colours that served as a visual signature. A pirate ship was a working vessel first and foremost, and navigating the waters of the Caribbean and the Atlantic coast required a level of skill and knowledge that is easy to underestimate from the comfort of our modern GPS-enabled world. Navigation in the age of sail was an art as much as a science, and the tools available to an 18th century mariner were crude by modern standards. The compass indicated direction, but it was subject to magnetic variation that changed from place to place. Latitude could be determined with reasonable accuracy using a quadrant or a sextant to measure the angle of the sun at noon, but longitude, the east-west position, remained one of the great unsolved problems of the era, and most navigators relied on dead reckoning, a method of estimating position based on speed, course, and elapsed time that accumulated errors with every passing day. Charts of the Caribbean were often inaccurate or incomplete, and the region was full of hazards, unmarked reefs, shifting sandbars, unpredictable currents, and sudden storms that could materialize with almost no warning and transform a calm sea into a killing ground in a matter of minutes. The hurricanes that swept through the Caribbean between June and November were the most feared natural phenomenon in the pirate world, and the records of the era are filled with accounts of ships destroyed, crews drowned, and entire settlements wiped off the map by these enormous tropical storms. A pirate captain who could read the weather, navigate safely through treacherous waters, and bring his ship to the right place at the right time to intercept a prize, was a man of genuine skill and intelligence, regardless of whatever else he might have been. A pirate ship was also a working vessel that it required the same constant maintenance and skilled seamanship as any other sailing ship. The crew spent much of their time repairing sails, caulking seams, scrubbing the hull, pumping bilge water, and performing the 1,000 small tasks that kept a wooden ship seaworthy in the corrosive environment of tropical seas. The physical appearance of real pirates was nothing like the dashing figures of the movies. Life at sea was brutal on the human body, and most pirates bore the marks of their profession. Skin was tanned to leather by the tropical sun, and scarred by rope burns, splinters, and the countless small injuries that were part of daily life aboard a sailing vessel. Many pirates had lost fingers, toes, eyes, or limbs to accidents, disease, or combat, and the hook hand and peg leg that are now clichés of the pirate image were based on a real phenomenon. François Leclerc, the 16th century French corsair, was one of the first recorded pirates to use a wooden leg, and many others followed him, because the loss of a limb was common in an era when the primary treatment for a serious wound was amputation. Teeth were a particular casualty of the pirate life, loosened and lost to scurvy, knocked out in fights, and rotted by the sugar and rum that were dietary staples in the Caribbean. Clothing was a mix of whatever the pirates could steal from captured ships, and a pirate crew in their plundered finery, wearing silk coats over ragged trousers and Spanish leather boots with no stockings, must have presented a bizarre and memorable sight. Bartholomew Roberts was famous for his elegant wardrobe, and Calico Jack Rackham got his nickname from the colourful calico cloth he wore. But most pirates dressed in whatever was available, and their appearance was more ragged than romantic. Shipworms, marine organisms that bored into the wooden hull and could reduce a sound ship to a leaking wreck in a matter of months, were a constant threat, and pirate crews regularly beached their ships and careened them, tilting them on their sides to scrape the hull clean and apply fresh coats of tar and tallow. Food was a perpetual concern. The standard diet aboard a sailing vessel of the era consisted of hardtack, a dense, nearly indestructible biscuit that was often infested with weevils, salt beef, or pork that had been preserved in barrels of brine, and could be so tough that sailors carved it into buttons and jewellery, dried peas, and whatever fish could be caught along the way. Fresh water was stored in wooden casks and went stale quickly in the tropical heat, which is one reason why pirates drank so much rum, the drink that was as central to pirate culture as the cutlass and the cannon. Rum was the product of the sugar plantations that were the economic engine of the Caribbean, made by fermenting and distilling the molasses that was a byproduct of sugar production. It was cheap, strong, widely available, and it kept better than water in the tropical heat, all of which made it the default beverage of the maritime world. Pirates drank rum straight, mixed it with water and lime juice to make grog, a concoction that helped prevent scurvy, though nobody at the time understood why, and mixed it with sugar, citrus, spices and eggs to create the elaborate cocktails that were the precursors of modern tiki drinks. The rum trade was itself deeply connected to the pirate economy. The triangular trade that connected Europe, Africa and the Caribbean, carrying manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Caribbean, and sugar, molasses and rum back to Europe, was the economic system that created the wealth that pirates preyed upon, and many of the ships that pirates captured were carrying rum, molasses, or the raw materials needed to produce them. The connection between rum and piracy was so strong that it became a permanent fixture of the pirate legend. And even today, 3 centuries later, the image of a pirate drinking rum from a bottle while standing on the deck of his ship is one of the most recognizable icons of popular culture. Rum was produced in enormous quantities by the sugar plantations and was cheap, plentiful, and a welcome alternative to brackish water. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a constant danger on long voyages, causing the gums to bleed, the teeth to fall out, old wounds to reopen, and eventually death if fresh fruit or vegetables could not be obtained. Disease was a far greater killer than combat in the pirate world, just as it was in every other aspect of 18th century life. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery and typhus were endemic in the Caribbean, and a pirate crew that spent any length of time in tropical waters could expect to lose a significant portion of its men to disease, even without a single battle. The surgeon aboard a pirate ship was therefore one of the most important members of the crew, and pirates went to extraordinary lengths to recruit medical professionals. When a pirate ship captured a merchant vessel that carried a surgeon, the doctor was almost always forced to join the pirate crew, regardless of his wishes, because his skills were too valuable to release. These pressed surgeons occupied a peculiar position in the pirate hierarchy, technically prisoners but often treated with considerable respect, and given a larger share of plunder than ordinary crew members. The medical equipment recovered from the wreck of the Wider included a remarkable collection of surgical instruments, including bone saws, scalpels, forceps, and a urethral syringe used to treat venereal disease, providing physical evidence of the medical care available aboard a pirate ship. The surgeon aboard a pirate ship, if there was one, was usually a man with minimal training who dispensed what remedies he had, typically mercury, laudanum and rum, and performed amputations with a saw and a hot iron when necessary. Despite these hardships, life aboard a pirate ship was in many ways better than life aboard a legitimate vessel, because the pirate ships of the Golden Age were, in some ways, among the most democratic institutions in the Atlantic world. Captains were elected by a vote of the entire crew, and could be removed from command at any time if the crew felt they were incompetent, cowardly, or unfair. This was extraordinary in an age when the captain of a Royal Navy vessel or a merchant ship was an absolute dictator with the legal right to flog, imprison, or even kill his subordinates. On a pirate ship, the captain's authority was limited to combat and the chase. In all other matters, the ship was governed by a set of written articles that every crew member signed or marked with an X before the voyage began. These articles, which varied from ship to ship but followed a remarkably consistent pattern, specified how plunder would be divided, what compensation would be paid for injuries. The captain typically received 2 shares of any prize, the quartermaster 1.5, and ordinary crew members 1 share each, which was far more equitable than the distribution of prize money in the Royal Navy, where the lion's share went to the officers and the common sailors received almost nothing. The articles also specified rules of conduct, including prohibitions against gambling, fighting aboard ship, bringing women on board, and deserting in battle. Pirates had a vivid and terrifying repertoire of punishments for those who crossed them, and while some of these punishments have been exaggerated by popular culture, others were every bit as horrible as the legends suggest. Keel hauling, in which the offender was tied to a rope, thrown overboard, and dragged beneath the ship from one side to the other, scraping his body across the barnacle-encrusted hull, was one of the most feared punishments in the maritime world. The barnacles could strip the skin from a man's body, and if the victim was dragged slowly enough, he could drown before being pulled to the surface on the other side. Sweating involved forcing a man to run around the mast while the rest of the crew prodded him with pointed implements, a punishment that was painful and humiliating but rarely lethal. Moses's law, or the administration of 40 lashes minus 1 with a cat o' nine tails, a whip made of 9 knotted cords, was a standard naval punishment that pirates adopted for their own use, though pirates tended to reserve flogging for serious offences, rather than the trivial infractions that earned sailors a lashing in the Royal Navy. The punishment for violating the articles was determined by a vote of the crew, and common penalties included marooning, being left alone on a deserted island with a pistol, a bottle of water, and little else. And in truth, pirates who wanted to dispose of a prisoner usually just threw them overboard without ceremony, or marooned them on a deserted island with nothing but a pistol containing a single shot, the implication being clear. Marooning was considered one of the cruelest fates a pirate could inflict because it condemned a man to a slow death from thirst, starvation, and madness under a relentless tropical sun, with the single bullet offering the only alternative. Alexander Selkirk, whose 4 years of solitary existence on a Pacific island inspired Daniel Defoe to write Robinson Crusoe, survived his marooning through extraordinary resourcefulness, but most marooned sailors were not so fortunate. The keel-hauling punishment, dragging a man under the barnacle-encrusted hull of the ship from one side to the other, was practised more by naval vessels than by pirates, but the threat of it hung in the air aboard every ship. Walking the plank, though, that particular punishment was far less common in reality than it is in the movies. The quartermaster, the second most powerful figure on a pirate ship, served as a kind of tribune of the people, representing the interests of the crew in disputes with the captain, and overseeing the fair division of plunder. Plunder was divided according to strict rules that gave every man a fair share. The articles of agreement that governed life aboard a pirate ship guaranteed rights that common sailors in the Royal Navy or the Merchant Marine could only dream of, including compensation for injuries suffered in battle, a kind of primitive disability insurance that was centuries ahead of anything available to legitimate workers. None of this excuses the violence, the murder, the theft, and the terror that pirates inflicted on their victims, but it helps explain why men chose the pirate life, and why let me tell you about the pirate flags, because they were far more than decorations. They were weapons of psychological warfare, carefully designed to communicate specific messages to the ships they were hunting. The Jolly Roger, the generic name for any pirate flag, came in dozens of variations, and each pirate captain of any reputation had his own personal flag that was as recognisable to sailors of the era as a corporate logo is today. The classic skull and crossbones, which we now associate with piracy in general, was only one of many designs. Blackbeard's flag showed a skeleton holding an hourglass and stabbing a heart, a message that meant your time is running out and we will show no mercy. Calico Jack Rackham's flag showed a skull above 2 crossed swords. Edward Lowe, whose cruelty was legendary even in an era that did not lack for violent men. Lowe was a Boston-born thief and street criminal who turned to piracy in the early 1720s and quickly established a reputation for sadism that shocked even his fellow pirates. He was reported to have cut off the lips of a Portuguese captain and cooked them in front of him, to have forced men to eat the hearts of their murdered companions, and to have committed acts of brutality so extreme that they were considered unusual even by the standards of an extraordinarily brutal age. Lowe operated primarily along the coast of New England and the mid-Atlantic colonies, and the terror he inspired in the merchant captains of the region was so great that some ships refused to leave port when Lowe was known to be in the area. His crew eventually mutinied and set him adrift in a small boat without provisions, and his ultimate fate is unknown, though various accounts claim he was captured and executed by the French, or that he died of his injuries after his crew cast him out. Lowe's career serves as a reminder that the pirate world was not all democratic self-governance and romantic adventure, but also included men of genuine evil, whose violence served no purpose beyond their own gratification. Flew a red skeleton on a black background. Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the era by number of prizes captured, had multiple flags, one of which showed himself and a skeleton holding an hourglass together, a morbid image suggesting that he and death were partners. The red flag, known as the Joli Rouge, from which the name Jolly Roger may derive, was even more terrifying than the black, because a red flag signified no quarter, meaning that the pirates intended to kill everyone aboard the target vessel, regardless of whether they surrendered. Most pirates preferred to fly the black flag first, because the threat of the red flag often convinced merchant vessels to surrender without a fight, which was far preferable to the pirates, since a battle risked damage to the prize and injury to their own crew. The entire system of pirate flags was designed to exploit fear, and it worked extraordinarily well. Many merchant ships surrendered the moment they saw a pirate flag, and some pirate captains went their entire careers without ever having to fire a shot in anger, because their reputation preceded them. The pirate flag. Before we reach the end of our journey, let me tell you about how the pirates of reality became the pirates of legend, because the transformation is one of the most fascinating stories in the history of popular culture. The pirates of the Golden Age were already celebrities in their own time, thanks to the newspapers, pamphlets and broadsides that reported their exploits to a fascinated public. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724 and possibly written by Daniel Defoe, though scholars have debated the authorship for centuries, was the book that defined the pirate legend for all time. Johnson's work, which contained biographies of the major pirates of the Golden Age, including Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Bonny, Mary Read, and dozens of others, was a masterful blend of fact and fiction that shaped the public image of pirates for generations. Many of the details that we associate with pirates today, the buried treasure, the walking the plank, the parrots on shoulders, the peg legs and eye patches and hooks for hands, can be traced back to Johnson's book and to the literary tradition it inspired. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, crystallized the pirate legend into its definitive fictional form, giving us Long John Silver, the most famous fictional pirate ever created, and the treasure map with its X marks the spot that has become a universal symbol of buried riches. Stevenson drew heavily on Johnson's general history, and the pirates of Treasure Island, with their rum drinking, their sea songs, their pieces of eight, and their treacherous charm, became the template for every pirate story that followed. James Barrie's Peter Pan, first performed as a play in 1904, added Captain Hook to the pirate pantheon and introduced the pirate legend to generations of children, and the movies, from Errol Flynn's swashbuckling adventures in the 1930s to the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise in the 21st century, have kept the pirate legend alive and evolving, each generation reimagining the pirates of the past in the image of its own fantasies and desires. The real pirates of the Golden Age would scarcely recognise themselves in these fictional versions, but they might appreciate the irony. Men and women who lived outside the law, who were hunted and hanged and displayed in iron cages as warnings to others, have become the heroes of stories told to children at bedtime and the stars of billion-dollar film franchises. The outlaws have conquered the culture, and the Jolly Roger, with its skull and crossbones grinning at the world, became a symbol not just of fear but of freedom, a freedom that was brief and violent and almost always ended in death, but that for a few extraordinary years offered men who had nothing a chance to live on their own terms. And before I let you drift off to sleep, let me tell you about one more aspect of maritime lawlessness that is rarely mentioned in pirate stories. The practice of wrecking, the deliberate luring of ships onto rocks or shoals to plunder their cargoes, was a crime that persisted along the American coast from the colonial period into the 19th century. The Outer Banks of North Carolina, with their treacherous shoals and shifting sandbars, were known as the graveyard of the Atlantic, and while most of the thousands of ships that wrecked there were victims of natural hazards, there were persistent rumours that the wrecking industry was centred on Key West, which by the 1830s had become the richest city per capita in the entire United States, all because of the ships that ran aground on the treacherous reef system that stretches for miles along the island chain. When a ship struck the reef, the cry of wreck ashore would ring out across the island, and dozens of small boats would race toward the stricken vessel, because under Admiralty law, the first wrecker to reach the ship and offer assistance could claim the right to oversee the salvage operation, and the salvage fees could amount to a quarter or even half the value of the cargo. Some wreckers became fabulously wealthy, building grand homes in Key West that still stand today, their fortunes built on the misfortune of others. The federal government eventually established a system of wrecking licenses and courts to regulate the industry, but the line between legitimate salvage and outright piracy remained blurry for decades. Wreckers displayed false lights to lure ships onto the shoals. The Florida Keys were another notorious wrecking ground, and the town of Key West grew wealthy in the early 19th century from the salvage of ships that ran aground on the reefs. The wrecking industry in Key West was technically legal, governed by Admiralty courts that awarded salvage rights to the first person to reach a wreck, but the line between legitimate salvage and piracy was thin. The coast of New England had its own tradition of wrecking, and the people of Nantucket, Cape Cod, and the islands of Maine supplemented their incomes with salvage from the many ships that came to grief on their rocky shores. This tradition of coastal lawlessness was a quieter form of piracy than the exploits of Blackbeard and Calico Jack, but it was just as deeply embedded in the maritime culture of early America, and it persisted long after the last pirate flag was hauled down. The pirates are gone now. Think about that transformation for a moment as you lie in the darkness and feel sleep pressing gently against your eyelids. Nassau, where Blackbeard and Charles Vane once divided plunder on the beach, is now a cruise ship destination where tourists buy rum punch and pirate-themed souvenirs. Tortuga, where the buccaneers of the Brethren of the Coast plotted their raids against the Spanish Empire, is a quiet Haitian island where fishermen mend their nets in coves that once sheltered pirate sloops. Port Royal, the wickedest city on earth, lies mostly underwater, its sunken buildings preserved in the silt of Kingston Harbour, like a time capsule from a wilder age. Barataria Bay, where Jean Lafitte ran his smuggling empire, is now a wildlife refuge, its bayous home to pelicans and alligators rather than pirates and smugglers. Ocracoke, where Blackbeard fought his last battle, is a peaceful village on the Outer Banks, where visitors fish and watch the sunset over Pamlico Sound. The places are the same, but the world that made them famous has vanished so completely that it is sometimes hard to believe it ever existed, and yet the evidence is there, in the cannonballs recovered from the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, in the gold coins from the Wider gleaming in a museum case in Provincetown, in the hand-drawn maps and weather-stained logs preserved in archives in London and Seville and Charleston, in the stories passed down through 3 centuries of retelling that still make us dream of salt spray and distant horizons, and the black flag flying against a tropical sky. The harbours they haunted have become resort towns and cruise ship ports. The shipping lanes they prowled are travelled by container ships the size of small cities. The old pirate haunts of Tortuga and Nassau are now tourist destinations where visitors sip rum cocktails on beaches that once served as careening grounds for pirate sloops. The harbour at the earthquake that destroyed Port Royal struck on June 7, 1692, and it was interpreted by many as divine punishment for the wickedness that had flourished there. In a matter of minutes, 2/3 of the city slid into the sea, buildings and streets and entire blocks disappearing beneath the waves as the ground liquefied under the weight of the town. Approximately 2,000 people died in the earthquake itself, and another 2,000 perished in the days that followed from injuries, disease, and the chaos that engulfed the survivors. The destruction of Port Royal, or what remains of it after the earthquake, lies beneath the waters of Kingston Harbour, and divers still occasionally bring up artefacts from the sunken city, wine bottles and clay pipes and coins that were in the pockets of buccaneers when the ground opened beneath their feet. In Charleston, where Blackbeard once blockaded the entire harbour and held the city for ransom, cruise ships now dock peacefully, and tourists walk cobblestone streets that echo with 3 centuries of history. The transformation is so complete that it takes an act of imagination to picture these calm, prosperous places as they once were, teeming with desperate men and the constant threat of violence. The Outer Banks where Blackbeard met his end are dotted with vacation homes and lighthouses, but the stories remain, carried on the salt wind, whispering of a time when the sea was wild and the coast was lawless, and a man with a fast ship and a black flag could make the whole world tremble. The pirates themselves were deeply superstitious people, as sailors in that era tended to be. They believed that whistling on deck could summon a storm, that killing an albatross would bring terrible luck, that having a woman aboard was dangerous unless she was disguised as a man, which of course Bonny and Mary Read had done successfully. They carried talismans and charms, consulted the stars and the flights of birds, and feared the dead more than the living. Ghost ships were a common feature of sailor folklore. Vessels seen on the horizon that vanished when approached, said to be crewed by the damned souls of pirates who had been too wicked even for hell. The legend of the Flying Dutchman, a phantom ship doomed to sail forever, was told and retold in every port from Boston to Barbados. Some pirates were said to have made bargains with the devil himself, trading their souls for fair winds and good fortune, and when their luck finally ran out, it was taken as proof that the devil had come to collect his due. Sleep well and dream of distant sails on the horizon,